Great. Well, welcome, Christian McNeill, to Unbroken. It's lovely to see you.
Well, it's lovely to see you too, Alexandra. And thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, honored to be here.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, you're going to be my first guest, actually. So
Even more, even more exciting. Thank
I'm
you.
thrilled to have you here. So why don't you tell us, yeah, anything about yourself that you'd like to share, your background, and maybe when you came upon the three principles?
Sure, thank you. Um, yes, my on the one hand, I have a background, a career in law, and I was a lawyer for a long time. And unbeknownst to me, at the same time as I was training to become a lawyer, I was working up an alcohol addiction, and I did not know that. I was not aware of that until it became a real crisis in my mid to late 20s. And at that point, I had yeah, a rock bottom kind of experience, and I'm followed immediately by a moment of clarity, and I got sober, and it was a completely life-changing shift. And although I had a lot of help with from 12 step movement in getting sober, the actual moment of clarity occurred, I mean, more or less in a gutter in the Edinburgh city centre on a Saturday night. And it's almost everything I say or talk about now is kind of informed by hindsight. I see things differently, or I understand what was going on in a way that I didn't at the time. I mean, I didn't know that my life was going to change in that moment, but it did. And the thing that happened then was what had previously been a daily compulsion to drink. I mean, I was able to sort of function, but I just had this daily compulsion to drink, no matter what I resolved in the morning, about being healthy and sober that day. It never worked out that way, and that compulsion disappeared in that moment. And I, got into that whole sort of 12 step thing, and working a program, and having a very different kind of life, and that was really um that was a great thing. It was a wonderful thing, but it was also an I think it was very countercultural here in Scotland. I live now in Glasgow, but I was living in Edinburgh at that point. And Scotland is a very boozy place. Everything is lubricated with alcohol. Apart from some breakfast meetings, perhaps, and and even more so then. So I was in this different world, and it became a sort of, I wasn't particularly secretive with it, but it became a bit of a secret side gig. It certainly wasn't what you led with. And so I had my career on the one hand, and then my secret side gig of recovery on the other.
Mm,
And almost just spontaneously, a lot of my kind of latent creativity, I think, woke up at that time. And I'd always had this other interest in, I'd been good at art at school, and I'd always been good at making things, and I enjoyed that. And I really kind of, that it was like that just mushroomed, and I got into things like stained glass at that point. But I was still, sorry, excuse me.
sure.
Um, but I was kind of enjoying the process of being sober, but I was still struggling a bit. And I think, as I see it now, I was still kind of looking for answers outside myself, just not drink. Um, so relationships became a bit compulsive, and unhappier, frankly, than they'd been before. I think there was too much in riding on it in my mind. There was a period when my smoking went through the roof. I quit that after a year, but I just, there was this. Um, I mean, it didn't even occur to me that this was a thing of looking outside yourself. I had some issues with overeating and bulimia, and being out of control around food, and just various things like that. So alongside the work, the secret side gig, that new things came in as I tried to um, medicate my mood, to find ways to feel better all the time. I had this idea that it was about, a sort of linear progression to being happier, being more spiritual, perhaps, which was also a challenge for me, because I didn't quite know how to place myself there. I certainly didn't have any kind of what you might call a conventional view of a god or anything like that. But I was open to it, and the 12-step program is about trying to find a spiritual power, a higher power that you can rely on, but it's not prescriptive. Anyway, I was, so I began, doing meditation courses, some of which I found horrendous. I just couldn't get it. All, personal development things, the forum. I mean, just every few months there was something new, and it was on this sort of quest to be kind of feeling good all the time, and it was like the more I was aiming for that, the more I was failing as I saw it, and other aspects of my life were just kind of going along. And I met someone, and we got together, and we had two children, and who are now grown up, wonderful, two adult children, and then that relationship fell apart, and it was devastating for me because I'd kind of been, I had a belief that, now that this painful, chaotic period of my life was behind me, that things should begin to fall into place. And my cherished dream was to have a happy family, to have a sort of happy home that was different from my own upbringing, and where my kids would thrive and all that. And then for this to fall apart was just catastrophic. And whatever faith I had, I think, in life, in the system, in the universe, was dashed in that, because I felt like, well, this is the payoff for living a sober life, or living a good life, if you like. And then, it hadn't worked out, and where where did I put myself with that? And then I began to have, this is before I encountered what we know as the three principles, but I began to have spontaneous insights, for myself. And again, it was after a period of significant emotional pain and confusion. And the first of those, really, that I remember, was one day, in a garage, a parking garage. I just thought, if you're going to have any quality of life, you've got to start listening to yourself.
Mm.
And there isn't anything particularly magical about those words, I think, but I knew that there was something deeper in this. This wasn't a prompt to be more egotistical, if you like, or, but there was something about listening. I knew that it meant listening deeply, and I knew that it was pointed to something other than kind of following the 12 steps. Not there's anything wrong with the 12 steps per se, but what I realize now is that until that point, I'd been kind of running everything through a filter of, is it sober? Is it right? That, am I living right, kind of thing? And it was like that. Forget that. Just trust yourself. Trust your own inner voice. And that was, a huge one, really, for me. And there were other less, sort of massive insights and realizations that came along, and were helpful. And I now see they're part of that process of things dissolving and falling away. So instead of having a rule book to live by life, you can forget the rule book. You'll know what to do moment to moment. And if for whatever reason you get it wrong, you'll deal with it. You'll make amends, you'll put it right, or whatever. And I so there was a sense of life opening up a bit, and new hope coming in. And I I trained in yet another modality around that time, which was, I found, the best thing so far for me, and that was NLP. And I did, several trainings at different levels. And then something came along, and an NLP trainer was offering a kind of practice, how to grow your practice with integrity. I think that's what the course was called. And I thought, well, that's excellent, because once my children are grown up, I can leave law and build up an NLP practice. And so that was my idea. Anyway, I went on this course, but it turned out it was all about something called the three principles.
Mm.
And I had stumbled across that once or twice previously through the works of Richard Carlson and Joe Bailey, but I hadn't really got it in the way that I was about to. And this was a weekend course which just changed my life. It really changed my life. It was the missing link of everything. And my first insight, having stumbled across the principles and informed by that, was coincidentally, given the name of your series, was that I'm not broken.
Mm.
Because I realized as I had that insight that I'd been operating on the basis that I was indeed broken, that my alcoholism was a sign of that. And my job was to work as hard as I could on my secret side gig to unbreak myself or to knit myself back together again. And suddenly the penny dropped. This is just nonsense. I was never broken. Now, that's not denial of the chaos of alcoholic drinking. And in my mind, mostly people who have had that, you can't, if you've had that loss of control around drinking, what I've observed is most people never get that back. So, sobriety is fine by me. I'm okay with that. And that makes a lot of sense to me. But that's a bit like being allergic to strawberries. It doesn't mean you're broken. It just means you've got that little adjustment to make.
Mhm.
um, yeah. And kind of from there, my life changed rapidly. And that's now 12 years ago. Almost 12 years ago, almost to the day, actually.
Oh, no
So
way.
I was on
Wow.
that weekend. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, that's so interesting. And so I'm just curious, did you bump into Joe Bailey's work um, in the 12-step space, or how did that come about?
Yeah. So I got sober in 1988, and around 1990, I stumbled across his book, The Serenity Principle, which I still would recommend as an excellent book
Hmm.
on, for people in recovery. And I'm sure also it helped me. I remember a friend of mine saying to me, another guy in recovery, saying, "I've noticed, Christian, that you never really beat up on yourself." And I think, there was something, and I'm sure that that was, to the extent that that was true, it was because I was influenced by Joe's work. That there was something about the neutrality of being, that addiction is a search for wholeness, if you like, or
Mm.
yeah, completeness in the wrong, but looking in the wrong direction. But there's a positive motivation behind it. And I use words like positive motivation as if I set out with a plan. I didn't. It kind of, it was all happening invisibly, and then all of a sudden, I find myself in this colossal mess. Yeah,
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. No, that's so true. We're always trying to take care of ourselves, aren't we?
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
Even if it looks like it's behavior that's maybe self-destructive or whatever. Yeah,
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 exactly. Okay, interesting. And so, um, so your so your sobriety and your interest in addiction obviously dovetails with the three principles.
yeah,
And then, so how did it come about that you wanted to write a book with your co-author, Barbara Smith, about addiction
yeah.
and the principles?
Well, yeah, so as you say, there was this dovetailing, and it really, Sid Banks, the founder of this work, wrote a book called The Missing Link, but it really was like that for me. It all fell into place. I was no longer searching. I was no longer signing up for another course to try and find the answer for the bit that was missing.
Hmm.
And I would say, and I knew that that it was helpful in the field of recovery. I just knew that, and of course, many of the speakers I heard early on, the teachers and trainers, were people in recovery themselves, or people who worked with um, addicts and alcoholics. So for the first few years, initially I was still working as a lawyer, and then I'd say life just had this colossal shift, and within 2 or 3 years, I had transitioned and was now working in this field. Um, And I wasn't particularly focusing on addiction. I was a bit, but not. I wasn't in sort of specializing. But someone else was putting on some webinars about addiction. And I didn't actually necessarily agree with everything that was being said, because I think sometimes there's a, especially if you haven't had the problem, there's a kind of theoretical um, message that's shared, like, that, yeah, for example, that people are alcoholics because they're not happy, and that's not it's just not that simple. It's
Mhm.
really not that simple. Like, and also I would say there are plenty of times that I was happy when I was drinking. It was, and I'm not saying that I have the ultimate bottom line, but there was a kind of message in the three principles that made me uneasy. And it was almost if you have a deep enough insight into the principles, you'll be able to drink in safety. And that was like a real that's a real warning bell for me, I think. And I also saw people, I mean, on one occasion somebody put on a conference about addiction and mental health. She was an alcoholic, but didn't, she didn't want to stop drinking. She didn't want to go to AA, and it ended up she was drunk at the
Oh, no.
conference and couldn't attend. And then everyone was lying about what was happening to her, saying she's not well and things like that. And I was thinking, this is nonsense. So I kind of hadn't, although it had acted as a completion, a gestalt, maybe, that dovetailing in my own life, I was kind of skeptical about what some people were saying, and it didn't seem to be borne out. It wasn't as if they were saying this and people were having a complete shift, and we're now able to drink, without consequence if they had an issue. But gradually that, I became sort of clearer in my own mind, and I think I was a guest on an an alcoholism webinar, and so was Barbara, and I could tell she was speaking. She knew what she was talking about. There's none of this bullshit or pink paint over everything that in what she was saying. So I reached out to her, and I think she'd had a similar sense about me, and that we, that we there was some level of common sense rather than wishful thinking, and experience that was valuable. So Barbara Sarah Smith, the co-author of my book, and I, we were both thinking about writing something, and I don't know which of us suggested, but one of us had said, "Why don't we write it together?" And it
Mm.
ended up being a most, phenomenal experience, as you know, because you helped us with the publishing. But it was, we wrote it in about a month, and we were in separate
Wow.
continents. We put a title and a framework together, where we spent a week together in the Azores, midway between America and the UK. And then when we went home, we sorted out, I'll do this chapter, you do that chapter. I mean, we had, we had um, permission to edit each other's and all that, but it was a great experience, a really great experience. So we published that almost, I think, a 1 week before lockdown, something
Oh,
like that. It was
yeah.
really, yeah. So right, yeah, we had to cancel our launch parties and all of that. We still haven't really done anything like that. But that's how it came about, and we've had some very nice feedback about our treatment of the principles. How we talk about that. And I like to think that people who are not addicts might also find that helpful. That they find the way we've expressed it simple
Mhm.
and clear. Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely find that. I reread it the other day in preparation for
Oh,
this
nice.
interview, and, yeah, it's just so clear and kind of grounded and down to earth, and I love that about it. And we should say, so the
Thank you.
title is Addiction: One Cause, One Solution,
Thank you.
and
Yes, we should say
yeah,
that.
yeah, absolutely. And I'll put links in the show notes to the book. So let's dive a little deeper into then some of the things that you talk about. So you there's a chapter about variability, and so you highlight, and I think this is such an important, it's kind of almost a beginner concept, but I really wanted to talk about it because I feel like it's so important, that the ups and
Mhm,
downs of life are really normal. And you spoke earlier about how you thought it should be a straight uphill
mhm,
line to some
mhm.
sort of, you didn't use these words, but level of bliss where you're just
Yeah.
happy all the
Mhm,
time. So let's
mhm.
talk about that, and why it's important to understand that variability is the norm for everybody.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, again, on that very first weekend, that was a phenomenal insight for me. You know, I don't know who said it, but somebody gave this idea that people do some form of this. And if you think about it, everything in nature does some form of this. And and I thought, yeah, God, me too. And I thought, well, actually, I'm okay with that, and if it never changes, I'm okay with that. I can live with that for the rest of my life, you know, and that I think that was also what took the striving, you know, off my plate. It's, you know, we're there. And that
Yep.
long may it continue. Now, the irony is in the accepting of that, I would say that the last 12 years have been bar none the happiest of my life. And there have been many happy and meaningful moments, you know, prior to that, but there's been a consistent happiness, which looks like this,
Hmm.
up and down, up and down. So that was huge, but it's all, you know, it's so interesting because I do see that all the time with clients, you know, that there's that many people have unwittingly and innocently bought into an idea that any unhappiness, any discord is pathological, and it's not. And sometimes I say, you know, I'll suggest, look, if if you want to be happy, you've got to be willing to be unhappy too. You know, and it's not to suggest that you're stuck with, you know, dreadful kind of depression or ennui or, you know, distress forever. It's not that, but the more you're fighting every down moment or you know every moment of low energy, that is the one thing you can do that will almost make it more intense. And if you can allow it to be without it meaning anything, because all what it simply is, as we know, is that in a low mood, the things that's happening, and it's happening automatically. We don't intend this, but all that's happening is we're taking our low thinking, our distressing thinking seriously. It's not telling us what the future is, because that's a fantasy. It's not telling us how much worse we are than everybody else, because that's a false comparison. And it's not telling us that the past is going to, you know, come and repeat itself. It's just telling us one thing, and the pain is actually an invitation to wake up to the fact that we're believing negative thinking.
Hmm.
But it's human to do that, and everybody does it at times. So there doesn't need to be any judgment on it, you know.
Hmm.
But it's so interesting that, you know, that's the this this one of a very, very common thing that people just want. Some want no pain. I think, well, you know, that's just that. Afraid I don't think that's on offer. I don't know anyone who's living that life, but a degree of detachment from it is possible, and certainly less of it. Once you know what's going on, we tend to create less of it if we know what's actually going on.
Yeah, I would agree with what you said about how these have been, you know, some of the happiest years of your life. And definitely for me too, once I saw this, the truth of this idea of variability and that fighting our different moods, especially the low ones, was what was causing more distress rather than
Mhm,
less. And that, yeah, once I saw that, it the my lows are much less low, I guess is the way that I would put it. And yeah, there's just a much more general sense of contentment overall, for sure.
mhm.
You know,
Yeah,
I guess that
yeah,
comes
mhm.
with acceptance or something. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but it's
But
such a simple
we're
concept, but
not
it's
out. Sorry, go
sorry,
on.
it's just gonna say it's such a simple idea, but it was so revelatory to me, and it just brings about so much change.
Yeah, yeah. And what I was going to say is that we're not outliers who coincidentally are
No.
experiencing it. It is a common experience of just an overall elevation of contentment and peace of mind and fulfillment once you have a sense of what's actually behind um, emotional distress and yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, the other thing I wanted to talk about was this idea that you address in the book about subtractive psychology. So, can
Mhm.
you talk to us a little bit about that, what it means, and why it's sort of a key to understanding these principles?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's not unrelated. And, I was thinking, because I saw this was one of the questions that you had posed earlier. And it occurred to me that you saw suppose you saw sleep as a problem. Suppose you didn't, for what somehow and you were going around, God, I mean, sometimes I just get so tired that I actually go unconscious for up to 8 hours. What on earth am I going to do about it? And you were trying to address the problem of sleep, which isn't actually a problem at all. It's a solution. But but you'd be doing all sorts of things to address a non-problem. Now, um, being in a low state of mind is not as predictable as sleep. It's not as regular. It's not as even maybe as necessary, if you like, but it is inevitable. But as we see that this up and down thing is not pathological, but it's the human condition. Um, well, we cease to have to do anything about it. That's which is why for me the need to retrain in something else or work harder at my secret side gig or do more meditation or journaling or blah blah blah. That all just flew off because there was no longer a problem. So there's that thing. Or another way I think of looking at, I've recently just co-hosted a series on living without problems. And it was interesting enough because as soon as I posted it, some things came up in my own life, which were a real invitation to walk my talk. One was to do with my now adult son who was going through a really hard time. So, the thing closest to my heart, my kids.
Mm.
And the other was we couldn't even, at first, we didn't get very many sign-ups for the course. I mean, we did eventually, but, so it was real, like, what are you talking about? Anyway,
Yes.
but somebody went with the class that the course did run, and somebody asked a great question early on and said, "So, are we just when we say living without problems, are we just kind of rebranding problems as challenges, or are we, or something like that?" It's a great question, and but the answer is no. It's not that. Now, there are in my way of seeing life, there are things that happen, and there's sometimes things that happen that need action. Some, let's say you have a symptom, and that you may need to go and have that checked out, and that checking out may lead to some treatment, and it may even lead to some quite unpleasant treatment. Who knows? Those things can happen. But most of our distress, in anything, and it could be something completely different. It could be a financial issue or a relationship issue. It could be anything. But most of our distress isn't coming from the thing, and it's coming from an absolute mind storm of stuff around the thing, what it means, how it's going to play out, what other consequences, why haven't other people got this, or but blah blah blah. There's just this endless, and lots of it is not even fully visible or in the level of awareness, but it's just churning and it's just going and going and going. And as we come back to the fact that everything in life is neutral, absolutely, including things that require action, but they are essentially neutral. But for our thinking, the thinking is dissolved or subtracted. The distressing feelings are dissolved or subtracted, and we're left with just the action that needs to be taken. So we're no longer we don't need to medicate our anxiety or our depression or our fear or blah blah blah. We're no longer trying to, and we're not even trying to change the circumstances so much, because the circumstances are mainly not the generator of the distress. It's the peripheral, it's almost always the peripheral stuff around that we're thinking about around the circumstance.
Hmm.
So there's just a lot less to be done. And we tend to come back to clarity and peace of mind more quickly. That has certainly been my experience.
Hmm. Yeah, that's been my experience as well. And um, yeah, just that sort of feeling of equilibrium returns so much more quickly when we're not caught up in all the storms that are going on around whatever the
Yeah,
situation is. Yeah.
yeah. yeah, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. And this is not some kind of, you know, goody two shoes positive thinking. I mean, I had an example of myself. I mentioned my son was going through quite a hard time, and there was one day when I got really caught up in it and what it would mean and where it was leading, and potential outcomes and hazards. And I was in a really upset state. I was very tense, anxious, close to tears, and I spoke to one of our colleagues, and that didn't particularly help. But I sort of knew, never mind, although I was still experiencing that distress, another part of me knew that I could come back to equilibrium, which I did later that day, and peace returned despite not a thing having changed on the outside. So the stuff was still going on with my son. Although, interestingly, after peace had returned, he got in touch and he shifted too, which sometimes happens. And
Mm.
I don't know. I mean, that's beyond my pay grade. But sometimes it's as though sometimes the universe responds, and we find the inner peace. It's almost as though something's communicated to others, but
Mhm.
maybe.
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah, yeah, who
Mhm,
knows? Um,
mhm.
yeah, it's so when we come back to this term, subtractive psychology, you point out in the book that what sort of the old paradigm of psychology had us do was with this sense of brokenness that we had, um, innocently, it was, and I was the same for years and years, trying to add things to myself, do more, change myself more in order to reach, the happiness that I felt I was searching for. And
Yeah,
so, in this understanding, what you're explaining is that really there's no need for any of that, and that
yeah,
the basic, um, foundational understanding that we are whole, we are unbroken, um, is what just allows us to come back to that sense of equilibrium without any effort. Like you said, you tried some things, you spoke to a colleague, but eventually it just happens on its own.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Whereas had I not known what we know around this, had I not had this information that's available, to anyone, I might have been saying, well, you're getting very anxious about this thing, so you might want to consider meditation, or you might want to step up your meditation, or what is it interfering with your sleep, and suddenly all these things would be reified. They'd have a solidity. They'd have and when what I did know, even in the midst of it, was that none of that was relevant. That I was caught up in my thinking, and it was painful. But
Yes. Yeah.
but it would pass. But it would pass.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And this is a perfect kind of circling back to the theme of addiction. So the other thing we do with ourselves when we have these upsets and problems is we medicate ourselves with
Yeah,
whatever it is, food, alcohol, whatever. And as we come to realize that, that's not necessary, because we will return to a state of equilibrium, always, then the need for that kind of outside medication becomes, less and less.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. Or there is a moment of clarity, rather than because it's not
Yeah.
it's of where it's just going, where that doesn't no longer make sense to go there. And I think people can be habituated or addicted to all sorts of different things, and some such, for example, food. You have to acquire a healthy relationship. You can't give it up. Absence isn't an option, and other
Mhm.
things, absence is the clearest, simplest way for most people to
Yeah.
deal with it. And usually there is a moment of clarity. There is a moment of insight that takes away the need for that thing. That it no longer looks like a good idea to the user.
Mhm. Yes, exactly. And if there's not one big one, my experience has been there can be a little series of smaller
Yeah,
ones,
yeah,
just
hmm.
gradually. Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We all this unravels differently for each of us. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we mentioned you published the book just before lockdown, so like February, March. Well, exactly almost as we're recording this 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if this is an unfair question, but have you had any since then, have you had any fresh insights about addiction?
Um, yes, yes, I have. Um, one actually was um, kind of in response to lockdown because at that point I wasn't a particularly frequent attender in at 12-step meetings. But I think there's a thing in the three principles that sort of there's a big focus on you don't need anything or anyone or any technique outside yourself. All the answers are within. And on one level, that's true. On that, but I think what became clear to me over lockdown was that I so valued going to AA meetings. I was not really bought into the whole lockdown thing. I thought it was an overreaction, and I didn't like the compulsory nature of it at all. So I really valued that, but for more than just human connection, also for I saw that there's a power in that. There's a spiritual connection that can happen between people as well, and I think that there's a biblical expression of where two or more are met in my name, I am also present. And you don't need to believe in any particular, you don't need to be a Christian to believe that, but I think there is something that happens when people come together. Now, one can have insights, and I often do on my own, and in any situation. But I think there's something that can happen in that place where people are coming together for the purpose of healing. And there's some very wonderful aspects of the 12-step program, which is very much is everybody's welcome. You're welcome where you're at. You don't have to subscribe to or believe in anything. So that's an unusual sort of thing in this world. But I've come to really value that. I think something can happen with another or a group of others that doesn't always happen alone. Um,
Mm,
and there's an importance to that. It's not that you need to do any. There's no particular formula about that. One can trust one's own instinct and own guidance. So if and when that's appropriate. But I've really seen that as a crucial thing. And I've, and I think it's almost a sort of anti-dogma, a dogmatic anti-dogma in some three principle communities about we don't need that or something. I think that. So I'm not on board with that. I think um, that community is important and it can be very helpful. And
mm,
I also think there's something about if you've been touched by this, some people can rush to share it with others. Maybe that's true of me, but I think the important thing is that you get it. One gets it for oneself first. That you have a sense of being changed and transformed. But then I think it's that you. Uh, this is a recovery phrase, but I think there's truth in it. You have to give it away to keep it.
mm,
And I've come to. I think that's true. I think because everything else in the world is pointing in a different way
mhm,
and so it's hard to be an island and kind of maintain because you're constantly having something different reinforced. So I think that it's a good thing if you're a teacher or a coach in this work to find yourself in both a place where you are a student as well as being that teacher, and
mhm,
to but it and I've come to see also that and again, this is from more 12-step thing that for me, it's important to have um, an attitude of being of service above making money. I mean, I'm a professional coach. I charge for my sessions and courses. My prices are not particularly high, but if I'm always ensure that if people haven't got the money, there are ways. I have a sliding scale and various other things and lots of free resources. So I think and the interesting thing is I've kind of been taken care of, and it doesn't always come through my fee income. I've been taken
mhm,
care of since in sometimes quite surprising and unusual ways since this since I got into this work.
Hmm. Oh, that's interesting. I love hearing all those. Yeah. uh,
Hmm.
yeah, sort of fresh ideas that you've had. Um, so given that you've just mentioned the work that you do, why don't you tell us about where we can find out more about you? And also, um, well, yeah, let's do that first, and then I'll ask you the second last question I had on my
Sure,
list.
sure. Well, my website, elementsofwellbeing.net, is,
Hmm.
I have some blog articles there, and my contact details and so on. Don't rely on the email at the moment; that's being updated. I think
Okay.
WordPress is doing something weird anyway. And I also have two Facebook groups with lots of, and a YouTube channel that are all kind of connected. One's called Recovery from the Inside Out, and the other one is called Three Principles Conversations. So I have lots of free videos and of interviews with other people on those, and or stuff with Barbara and I in the recovery one, and
Hmm.
so yeah, there's you can, and you'll contact me through any of those, or just Google me. And you'll, um,
Right. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, and I personally highly recommend following you on the Facebook pages because then you send out notice about the classes that you teach. And I've taken a
yeah.
number of those and they've just been excellent, just amazing. I've enjoyed them so much.
Well, that's one of the absolutely wonderful gifts of this work was my current mentor, Mavis Carn. I was interviewing her for something, and she asked me if I ever did webinars. I said, "Oh yes, definitely do." So, said, "Would you like to do some with me?" So yeah, and I like to. So they have been wonderful. We've been doing that for about a year and a half now, I think, and we sort of do these short 4 webinar series, and
Yeah,
people can sign up for them, and everything's I think quite reasonably priced and accessible. That's
absolutely.
the key. Mm.
Hmm.
So yes, those are
Yes.
wonderful. Mavis is a treat. She is in her 80s and she's still going
Yes.
strong, and she's fabulous. Yeah.
Yes,
Mhm.
yeah, she's incredible, and I thank you for introducing me to her. I She's just such a delight. Yeah, and it's those
Yeah.
classes have been so great.
Oh,
So
thank you.
we're winding up now, and I just wondered if there's anything else you'd like to share that we haven't touched on, anything that feels important to say before we wind up.
Um, well, I guess I just want to say to anyone who might be listening who is new to this, and if anything in this conversation or any of your other conversations is whetting your appetite, or making you curious or appealing to you, follow that instinct. Do yourself a
Mm.
favor. Your life will change beyond your wildest imagination.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, absolutely true. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Christian. It's been so lovely
Yeah,
connecting with you again. It's been a while since we've chatted, and thank you
thank
for being
you.
my first guest.
Thank you very much. It really, really, really is an honor. And I hope the series is a massive success. I'm sure it will be. And I'm looking forward to watching the rest of the interviews as they come out. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye bye.